Basically, I think it's great. Mindfulness at whatever level, and this seems to be borne out, in people's experience, and when it's taught in a secular way, it seems to be helpful. People are getting something from it, so I think that's great. I don't have any problems with that at all, and I'm glad that it's happening. In that, I'm hoping that the deeper aspects of the practice and the teachings are not lost for those who want to pursue them. That's all. So people are not left with the impression that that's all that mindfulness can offer. If people choose to stay with that, we could say, level of practice, that's fine, because it definitely enhances the quality of one's life. And there's more. And so I think it's just helpful, even in the teaching of secular mindfulness, for people who are aware of the greater depth of potential that's possible, even just to mention that. That for those of you who are interested, there are other possibilities as well in this practice. That's also the whole spectrum, of what's possible is known.
If I recall correctly, there is a Buddhist sutta. This is where my limits as a Pali scholar will likely show themselves, but isn't there a sutta called the Mahamangala Sutta where the Buddha talked about different levels of happiness, and basically it's just a straightforward acknowledgement that there's a hierarchy of happiness, or many tiers to happiness, where the fact that there are deeper, more profound forms of happiness that go into very esoteric areas of things like Buddhahood, that doesn't negate that every one of these steps is a step in the direction of happiness. So just having a healthy family is a form of happiness. It just goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the esoterica of Nibbana.
There's the flip side of that as well. For those people who might be thinking that by going or aiming for, the higher happiness, somehow they're going to miss out on the kinds of happiness we're more familiar with. My first teacher, his name was Munindraji, he used to say something which I really loved. He said, if you aim for the highest happiness, all the others come along the way. So it's not a question of missing out on anything. It's actually enhancing the probability that we'll experience all the kinds of happiness, because we understand their causes. We understand what gives rise to them.
That's a nice sentiment. I'm not so sure I've seen that borne out in the Dharma community. What I believe I've seen among Buddhists and hippies and New Agers and people who have, quote, aimed at the highest happiness, explicitly in meditative terms, I feel like I've seen a lot of casualties of the Dharma. I've seen people who have, because they spent crucial years of their lives engaged in these esoteric pursuits, they actually didn't become self-actualized in ways that they really would want to have been, to access ordinary levels of happiness, to have ordinary careers, or to start families at the right time, or to make money when it was easy to make money, so that they had money when it was harder to make money, and when they're older. And so there's a kind of mismatch between the Enlightenment project. We should get to what the most esoteric goal of meditation actually is, but I feel like I've seen people who, I guess, fell through the cracks in a way, because it's hard. It's hard to reach the goal. It's hard to meditate so effectively that your feeling of well-being becomes impregnable and is no longer dependent on anything substantive happening in your life, right? So it's hard to become the person who doesn't really care whether you got to have kids, if you're the person who really wanted kids, right? But now you've spent 20 years in Nepal studying with lamas, and you missed that chapter of your life. So, do you want to say anything about the casualties of the 60s, or the Dharma, or any other way you want to frame it?
Well, I think the 60s are fast fading into the mists of history.
The 60s are back. With psychedelics are now being used in science now.
I think the point you raised is an important one, in that undertaking a path of practice in the way that you talked about really requires or is helped by a certain level of, you could say, emotional maturity or understanding and realistic assessment, both of one's life, one's opportunities, one's aspirations, one's goals, and to somehow integrate all of that in one's decision. So there are many ways to practice, and even in the Buddhist time, many lay people practiced them and achieved high levels of realization. So if there is that strong wish to both go as deep as possible, in the spiritual path, and also live a fulfilled, we could say, worldly life, it's helpful to know that about oneself. And so then one makes the choices appropriate to that. And it may not be going off for 20 years to Nepal. We may be doing intensive practice in ways that fit into the more worldly aspirations. But it's really no different than, somebody who just has this thirst or hunger or passion to become an artist. And they devote years of their life to their art. And they may never be a Rembrandt, and they may end up in a worldly situation that's not so successful in worldly terms. But they have fulfilled that side of themselves. And so I think it's the same thing. Some people have a passion for this kind of practice and are willing to say, okay, whatever comes will come from it.
Right.
And as I said, other people may also be very dedicated but want to be more inclusive of other aspects of their lives. So I think both are really possible. And there'll be some people who make mistakes, who make the wrong choice, which happens in every arena.
Let's talk about this concept of realization. You just used that term, enlightenment. I guess an earlier stage could be called awakening. What do these words mean, and how do you explain them to someone who hasn't had any experience in meditation?
I think the simplest and most pragmatic way of understanding it, and I think we probably have talked about this before in previous discussions, but I find this just the most down-to-earth way of understanding it rather than some great mystical experience, is the mind free of those patterns and tendencies that cause suffering, like in traditional Buddhism, of greed and hatred and delusion. So we could say enlightenment is the mind free of those forces. Now this can be interpreted in two ways, and we've talked about this, in fact, just last night. It can be interpreted in terms of these forces are actually uprooted so that they don't arise again. And this is a very classical view of the path of enlightenment, that they're progressively weakened and finally uprooted from the mind stream. Another way of viewing it, which many teachers and traditions do, is not so much, the understanding that they're uprooted, but rather in the moment of their arising, they're seen through. So we're not caught by them in any way. In both cases, the mind is free. I have a slight bias towards one of these views, but I take a somewhat agnostic position in terms of the ultimate truth of one or the other. And I'm kind of waiting to see.
Right.
And it'll be interesting when we have finally accomplished the fullness of the path, we'll know for ourselves whether they're uprooted or they're simply seen through.
Let's drill down on that a little bit more. So what does uprooting mean in your experience? What can you say firsthand that you have uprooted so that you know it's possible to uproot such a thing?
Well, certainly some hair follicles.
I feel that somehow I'm following you on that.
They have been uprooted.
Despicable path.
They don't seem to be arising again. So that's one very significant arena.
You have long been a master on that path.
So this is a very classical progression, but one that I feel that I have experienced the first stage in this process, the deeply rooted view or conception of self, that there is some self that's at the center of all experience and to whom all experience refers. And this is a deeply rooted conditioning of the mind. This is the common and the common sense view. You know, that I'm the one doing it all.
So you can point to a day on the calendar where you lost that feeling.
Yes.
So say more about that.
So the image that came to mind, you know, and it was a meditative experience arising out of a very clear looking at the mind itself, at awareness itself. And at a certain point, as the appropriate conditions came together, there was the experience of, and here's where it's going to sound a little esoteric and it's very hard to put into language, but in the observation of this stream of phenomena, you know, which is our life, our mind and our body, the experience of, we could call it, it has been called the unborn or non-occurrence, or what in that moment in my own mind I framed it as zero. You know, and so in that experience of the zero center of it all, it became clear that there was no, and this is a little pun on the word, there was no one to whom it was all happening. It was just phenomena arising and passing away in a certain pattern that could conventionally be called self or Joseph or I. So those words are fine. It's not that we have to get rid of that language. But there's the understanding that it doesn't ultimately refer to any existing phenomena because the mind has opened to zero. You know, and that was the transforming moment. And then, you know, still the mind gets caught many, many times in becoming identified with various things, thoughts and emotions. So it's not that moment.
Let me just go over that one more time with you, because it sounds like what you're saying there is that you had this experience, and obviously you and I have spoken about this for hours and hours, if not weeks and months. In our previous podcast, I think we probably got into this a fair amount, but there are two ways this could be uprooted for you. You could have had this experience of zero, and then that has certain implications for you going forward. So you experience zero on a Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, someone says, hey, do you still have a stable self that's carried through from one moment to the next in consciousness? And you retrospectively, based on the experience on Tuesday, you think of its implications and you say, oh no, I know that's not the case. I've uprooted that delusion because I had this experience scarcely 24 hours ago that informs me that that can't be true. Now, you obviously hear or see where I'm going with this. The other form of uprooting is based on having had that experience on Tuesday. Now Wednesday and every subsequent day for the rest of your life, when any person taps you on the shoulder and says, do you have a self? And you look, you actually are presented with the vivid evidence of the absence of a sense that you used to have, right? You used to have a sense which is no longer there in any moment where you check for the rest of your life.
Yes.
So presumably you are signing up for the second option, right?
Yes.
But are there people in the first category who have an experience like what you're calling zero, but their loss of a self-view is this retrospective, I bank this as a kind of conceptual change for myself?
I think that there are both, because traditionally, in the traditional unfolding of meditative practice, especially of this particular kind of practice, there is you could say, a spectrum or deepening understanding of selflessness on different levels. And so people can have a very deep understanding of the selflessness of the process, where they see it's just empty phenomena rolling on. That's all that's happening. And people are in that experience and experiencing it fully, but it's not yet at the point where the view of self has been uprooted. And that's where this notion of uprooting, I think, really has significance. Because in what I just described, that is the experience of many people of your first alternative. Where they really have had the experience of selflessness, but it's not something that is totally uprooted. And so on Wednesday or Thursday, they can remember that.
Right, but the self comes back.
The sense of self.
The sense of self comes back, and then their concern is how to get back to that feeling of selflessness through practice. It's not obvious that the self isn't there in the first place.
Well, it can be obvious to us. I mean, I think at deep levels of practice, it is obvious at that time.
No, at that time, but afterwards, when they're no longer at any kind of deep level of practice, then they're left to remember this period of selflessness that they had when they were.
I don't know whether this is going to get a little too
esoteric
for this conversation, but for me, it's actually quite a helpful template where the Buddha talked about the 3 levels of hallucination or distortion. He talked about hallucination of perception, hallucination of mind, and hallucination of view. And these are 3 different levels. So hallucination of perception is when you walk on the road, you see a stick and you think it's a snake. So you're just perceiving it incorrectly. That's pretty easy to remedy. You just walk up closer.
You look more closely at the stick.
Okay, this is not a snake. The second level of distortion or hallucination is called distortion or hallucination of mind. And that is all the thoughts that come about from thinking it's a snake. And so then there's fear and there's whatever thoughts you have or feelings about a snake. So that's a more full, it's not just a simple perception. We're creating a certain world that we're living in.
Right.
So that's a little hard. If we're lost in that world, we might not even be motivated to look more carefully. So that's a little harder to uproot. But still, it's not that difficult, because if we do look a little more carefully, we'll see. This is just a piece of wood. The deepest level is hallucination of view. And
that's when you become a snake catcher.
Exactly. And when the hallucination of view is strong, and we have seen this play out in every domain of our culture, most recently in the political arena, where when people hold to a certain view strongly, it doesn't matter what the evidence is. You can present all the evidence in the world, and it's not going to change that view. So this hallucination is the hardest one to uproot, because the mind gets so fixed. That's why the uprooting of the view of self is so transformative. In the first 2 cases, the perception of self, we may, see in the moment, and even get caught in hallucination of mind. But when the view of self has been uprooted, then those other 2, even though they may still happen, we may get caught again in those other hallucinations, but the view is gone. And then that's why they don't have much hold. There's simply the residue of old patterns.
Okay, but to go back to your particular experience of uprooting, which you can cash out, in at least in a first-person sense of, you have proven this at least to yourself, to your own satisfaction. This is true, yes. Sometimes,
if not to you.
Yes, you'll be hard-pressed to prove it to me on any given day. So, post-Tuesday, whenever you look for yourself, there is no self, right? It's not like you were at any point after that experience, you were left with an hour, a day, a week, feeling like, oh man, the sense of self is back.
Well, it's not so much the sense of self, the view of self. Because as I say, you can still get caught. I can still get caught in different emotions and different thought patterns. But there's the understanding that they themselves are selfless.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that, because I want to talk about what it's like to still get caught or identified with thought post this uprooting of the view of self. But before we go any further in the direction of selflessness, from a Western psychological perspective, loss of a sense of self sounds
Undesirable.
almost by definition like a form of psychopathology.
Yes.
And I think it's well understood, or at least it's often believed, that there are many forms of neurosis and psychosis that can be described as a kind of erosion of
Yes.
self-boundaries, self-coherence.
And is that what you feel when we're together?
That's what I've noticed in you. Are there pathological
Yeah.
reductions of self? And what's the relevance of that phenomenon, if in fact it exists, to this, what you're clearly considering a normative breakthrough psychologically that is all to the good, which is just recognizing that the self doesn't exist as conventionally
You
thought.
know, first, as you know, I'm not a psychologist, and so I'm not very familiar with either the range of pathologies or the way the term self is used or defined psychologically. My understanding from just in speaking with people about this, and psychologists and therapists, the term self can be used in a lot of different ways, and so it means something very specific in what we call the Buddhist context or the meditative context. But in a psychological context, there are pathologies where what I call a kind of healthy balance of the mind. When the mind is operating in a healthful way, one could call that a healthy self.
Right.
And that's fine. I don't have any problem using the term, in that way. And I think the pathology you're describing is when that balance is not there, in one way or another. The meditative experience and what Buddha was talking about, in my understanding, is something very different than that. And it is just the belief or the view that there is some self-existent, unchanging something or other that is at the center or the core of our unfolding. You could say it might well be that there are pathologies which mimic that, and could look like that.
So you mean there are pathologies that could look like a form of awakening or enlightenment?
Yeah.
Crazy people can make some of the same noises as enlightened yogis.
Possibly, although I've not seen that. I mean, I don't have a huge experience in this, but I've certainly, in the course of all these years of teaching, come across in meditation, in periods of meditation, of people getting lost in different pathologies of mind, and it does not look at all the same. Because as I said, the balance, there's no mental balance or ease at those times. Whereas, the insightful understanding into selflessness is tremendously freeing.
So let's talk about what it's like to lose the sense of self and yet not
The
be...
view of self.
You've corrected me on this point now, I think 3 times, except
You're a slow learner.
previously, the previous 2 corrections, and I believe our podcast listeners will back me up here, have been, you've corrected me toward the phrase sense of self. I talk about the illusoriness of the self, and you've corrected me towards sense of self. I just use sense of self, and you've moved the goalpost to view of self. So let's figure out
Okay, what we're talking
what your
about.
pet peeve is here. Why not just say that the self isn't what it seems and doesn't exist as most people think it does? I mean,
Okay,
why
I'm
not
good
just
with that.
bite the bullet there?
Yeah, I'm
so,
good with that.
So forget about sense, forget about
Okay.
view. Let's just talk about the self.
Okay.
Most people think that there's an ego riding around in the center of their heads or in a stream of consciousness that is unchanging. There's a subject
Right.
in the middle of their lives that's not simply identical to their experience, but it's having the experience,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So
yes.
that's the thing that if
Yes.
you look closely at, it disappears, and yet your experience doesn't necessarily
Yes,
disappear.
exactly. No.
Right. Okay, so we're on the same page
Okay.
there.
Thank you.
And I've got you off my back, happily. For those of you who don't understand why I treat Joseph with so little regard in these contexts, it's because we go way, way back. But if you listen long enough, you'll understand. how much I venerate him as a teacher of meditation and a friend, I should say. So you lose this sense of self, which is to say that you have an experience in meditation after which now every time you look, every time you pay attention, every time you're no longer distracted by the flow of thought or anything else in your life, and you pay attention consciously, you do not feel like a self the way you used to, right? You've lost this sense
Right.
of there's a subject riding around in your head. Now, would you go so far as to say that is an experience of non-duality? I mean, that non-duality is not the concept you get in Theravada Buddhism where you first had this experience, but this is very much the concept you get in some other traditions. Is selflessness, in that sense, synonymous with non-dual awareness, or do those break apart for you at all?
First to say, the term non-dual awareness is not a term that I generally use, and there are reasons for that. But given your question and the use of that term, I would equate the two, because the sense of duality comes from subject and object. And if there's no subject, then there's no
Yeah.
duality.
Right.
The reason I don't like to use the term is because, to me, the use of the term, I don't know. I think there's a particular word for when something contains within it an inherent contradiction.
A performative contradiction.
Yeah. So to me, the use of the term non-dual, in contrast to the dual, the term itself is creating duality, and so that's why I don't like to use
That's
the
why
term.
I guess emptiness, the concept of emptiness, gets at it a little more. I mean,
Yeah.
not to the layperson's ear in
Right.
English,
Yes.
but when you get
Yes.
into what is
Yes.
meant by emptiness in Buddhism.
Yes, that's why I would, for myself, I use that term more
Right.
frequently.
Maybe we'll get there. I think we have a question on that topic. But so back to the experience, though. You lose the sense of self, but you don't lose it permanently in the sense that you can still be distracted by thought, identified with thought. So you're going about your business and you have a thought that makes you angry. And by definition, for that period of time, whether it's 5 seconds or 5 minutes, you don't even know you're thinking. Arguably, being lost in thought is a kind of psychosis. It's a psychosis that's universally subscribed. Everyone's in this condition most of their lives. But to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking and just talking to someone who's not there, right? It's certainly analogous to dreams that we have while we're asleep, right? And they're not lucid. We don't know we're dreaming. So you're in that delusion, arguing with someone who's not there, and it's kindling all of those negative emotions. And then mindfulness comes online. You recognize a thought as a thought. The thought, images, and language just vanish in the mysterious way that they always do. And you are left once again reestablished in this moment of clarity, which again, now the signature of clarity is there is no self to be seen, right? Now, in the beginning of people's practice, they don't necessarily have that experience. When people start practicing mindfulness, they feel like it's me over here being mindful. And so that their sense of self is not put into question at all. But they can still have this experience of being lost in thought, noticing a thought, the thought goes away, and now it's just me here being mindful again,
Yes.
waiting for the next thought or paying attention to the breath or whatever. But still the self is there. So, but after you've had this experience of uprooting the sense of self, in a moment of mindfulness, you have no more self. So then, how would you describe the character of being lost in thought for someone like you at this point? So when you're lost, and the next moment of mindfulness has not arrived, right? So you are lost in thought. Is there any difference between you now and an ordinary person who has no meditative experience, or who you were before you had your uprooting of self-view? And just to clarify, I think it's clear, but just to clarify, I'm not at all talking about what is available to you by virtue of the next moment of mindfulness, or
I
like it's just that time sequence when you are lost.
Right. I would say that, and this is not precise what I'm about to say. So It's my sense of the difference. And that is, there seems to be, one might say, different intensities of being lost. And so even though the mind gets lost, and in the way you described, well, I'll put it another way, and I really haven't thought about this before, so that's why I'm trying to formulate now, a description of my experience. Looking at it from another side, I think the difference of the intensity of being lost is indicated by the greater ease in coming back to mindfulness and letting go.
Right.
And that I've really observed. So even when the mind is really lost, because it's not so completely lost, or so fully lost, or I don't know exactly the right words, it takes a lot less time and there's a lot more ease in seeing through it again. So that's some reflection of the difference.
Actually, I have a different view of it for myself, but it could be described in exactly the same experience, but it's almost a mirror reverse of what you just described. I feel like the experience of being lost is equivalent for everyone, equivalent for me at various points in time in my life, and equivalent by just assumption for everyone, whether they know how to meditate or not. But one thing that happens with practice is intense emotion, especially suffering, but even positive emotion, but especially negative emotion, functions as a kind of alarm clock, functions as a kind of mindfulness alarm. So by the very nature, you don't get very far before mindfulness starts to come online as you turn up the dial of intensity. And if your mindfulness at that point, having uprooted this view of self, if your mindfulness is synonymous with this loss of subject-object perception, well then, as you turn up the intensity of experience, you begin to just cut through to a sense of selflessness almost by definition. Whereas I feel that if you put my mind on a channel of really kind of low-level, mediocre experience, my being lost, let's say, I'm trying to navigate, the phone tree of, some corporation I'm trying to call, right? So I haven't started to tear my hair out, because then I would begin to notice my mind's getting out of balance, but I'm just trying to follow the prompts, right? Did they say 1 or 2? In that moment of identification with thought and uncertainty and, engaging some behavioral program that has nothing at all to do with me paying attention clearly to the character of my own consciousness, I feel like in that moment, my mind is as dull and dualistic and unilluminated by practice as it could ever be. I don't know how it would be different in that moment, because that's just a moment of fixation on some object. And
I can relate to the way you're describing that. But I think, and again, we're using images now to describe these mind states, but I think one of the differences is, in a moment of being lost, it's like we're fixated. We're holding on to a thought or a feeling or an emotion. Maybe there are degrees of how tightly we're holding on.
Well, yeah, because if it gets tighter and tighter, then the alarm goes off.
No. Yes. What I experience is that because of a certain understanding of selflessness, even when we're lost, the mind is not holding on as tightly, and it doesn't require the level of intensity for the alarm to go off.
Right.
So those two are the consequences, I think, of some understanding that it's all selfless, even when one is caught. The mind is not holding on as tightly to it, and we become aware that it is holding on to whatever extent quicker.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although that seems to be this same process. It's just, quicker is, the quicker you get, the less there's a sense of ever holding on to anything or being lost in anything. So actually, this raises a related point, again, from the other side. So given that the sense of self is illusory.
Yes,
It's not that you
get rid
have a
of it.
self that really exists that
Yes.
you kill through meditation.
Correct.
You're seeing that something was never there that you presumed was there. So it's true to say of ordinary people who have never meditated, who have never thought about their minds in these terms, who have a very strong sense of self and have no idea what we're talking about right now. It's true that their self isn't there any more than your self is there in each moment of consciousness. So what is really happening for people is they're not noticing when their self isn't there. So when you're identified with thought, it's not like that creates a self that has to be canceled through some other effort. It's just the experience of being identified with thought is a kind of selfless experience, but it's just a full immersion in the thought, right? So if it's an angry thought, you're busy getting angry. And what I feel like happens for people is that they're often losing their sense of self in ways that they could recognize. Because they don't know how to meditate, they can't do this on demand, so they can't control it. But retrospectively, whenever they're asked, whenever they're tapped on the shoulder and you say, well, how do you feel right now? Their sense of self always comes online. The self-concept always comes online. But if they could pay attention to the flow of their experience, they would recognize that it's constantly being interrupted by them just being immersed in classical flow experiences that are positive, but even just being lost in their work or just being distracted. Just being distracted has the character of losing yourself. You're lost to the dream of whatever you're paying attention to.
Yeah, I know. I think I agree with all that, and it's really interesting even to expand it a little more. I was thinking of the sense of flow, that's been talked about, which is an experience that many people have, whether it's in sport or music or different experiences. But also, I think we lose the sense of self very often in acts of generosity or love or compassion, where it really, those do become selfless expressions, spontaneous expressions. So I think people do have the experience, at different times in their lives through a whole variety of circumstances. And as you say, that the particular quality of the selfless aspect may not be attended to, even though they're experiencing it that way.
Well, in fact, I think the place where people most reliably lose it are classically unreflective experiences like watching television, watching a movie, reading a book, where you're just immersed in something. I mean, you're having reactions, you're having a kind of vicarious experience. This is not the same thing as meditation, but people are kind of subjectively disappearing into a sort of dreamscape when they're being entertained. Right. In the moments when they're not is when the entertainment isn't working.
Right.
When you're aware that you're just staring at a screen, or you're aware of the other people next to you in the movie theater, well, those are moments where you're not on the ride. But when you're really on the ride, there is a kind of just loss of self-consciousness.
Yes, but somehow it feels important in some way to distinguish that.
None of that counts as meditation practice.
Or even, I think in some way, I don't know if we could tease it apart, but I think fundamentally it's a different experience than the selflessness.
Well, you're not aware of selflessness in the moment. I guess what I'm trying to point to is that we have a kind of amnesia for selflessness. I think people are constantly having their sense of self interrupted by watching television or by just suddenly paying attention to anything or being lost in thought. And yet whenever they reflect on who they are or what it's like to be them, because they don't have mindfulness that cuts through to the obviousness of selflessness in each moment, they feel like, oh, it's just me here again. Here's my sense of self. And they kind of project that back into all the previous moments, but it wasn't actually there in those moments. It was actually interrupted. Retrospectively, you can appreciate how unreliable or impermanent this feeling of I is, because some of the experiences you like in life are synonymous with its interruption. So when you get fully immersed in anything.
Can I conclude then that my habit of spy book reading is actually furthering and deepening my understanding?
No, unfortunately not. This is the habit to which Joseph refers. Joseph is the kind of person who you can walk into an airport bookstore and stand before the wall of garish
Junk books.
covered books, just all the brightly covered terrible paperbacks, and he can look from top to bottom left at a whole wall and honestly say, I've read all of these. I've been in that airport.
Almost.
I think this is a true story.
This is just the expression of selflessness, Sam.
Well, yeah, or non-discrimination. Given an infinite amount to read, you have found the part of the infinite set that is not worth reading. Krishnamurti, didn't he demand that his students read nothing other than junk books, detective novels? Because he was trying to cancel their spiritual materialism. He didn't want them reading Buddhist suttas or anything. So it's working for you, Joseph. Did you ever meet Krishnamurti?
I didn't meet him personally, but I was at some of his lectures.
Quite related to what we were just talking about. So what percentage of your time would you say you are in the clarity of selfless mindfulness? And what percentage is, this is a question you're not going to want to answer. There are Buddhist taboos around answering questions like this. Although the Hindus will be quite forthcoming here. And what percentage of time are you lost in the sense of being identified with thought, thinking without knowing that you're thinking? First, how confident are you that the answer you're about to give
is honest,
has any relationship to what is true of your mind? Are you in a position to answer this question?
Before answering that, I think the question needs clarification, because really have to be more specific about what being lost in thought means. So, for example, the question could refer to, how often are you lost in long trains of thought, in stories? That you're in the story and whatever you're doing, in the course of a day, you're just in your mental world and in some story or other, and 5 minutes later you realize and you wake up.
Right.
So that's one understanding of being lost.
Let me just clarify it then. Whether it's for a long time or a short time, if you add up all the time, what percentage of your time is it? If it's 5 minutes, but you've punctuated those 5 minutes with a million interruptions, I'll grant you that's a very different kind of 5 minutes than five uninterrupted minutes.
But I was thinking of something else, not so much punctuating the 5 minutes, but rather an experience I've had, and this has become very interesting for me, and a significant part of my practice is just really watching for the very quickly passing thoughts that pass through the mind that are not disturbing, they're light, they just pass through, but which we hardly pay attention to because they're not particularly impactful. So
it's like an undercurrent of thought.
Yeah, an undercurrent, and they may not be long. It may not be a stream. It may be
right.
There may be a few seconds of just kind of a light thought.
You're sort of describing it as though you're mindful of those thoughts.
No,
you're talking about being identified briefly with those thoughts.
No, what I'm saying is that I think that there's a large percentage of the time that kind of undercurrent of quickly passing light thoughts is going through. So